Hello and welcome to Europe's Climate and Environment, a new video podcast by the European Environment Agency, where we break down the latest news and data on the environment, climate and sustainability through the insights of our experts.
We continue to see chemical pollution of air, water and soil, and we see, of course, large-scale risks and impacts today from climate change. At the same time, there are seeds of hope. The change in the energy system, which has delivered significant cuts in greenhouse gas emissions, the penetration of renewables into the energy system, that's a really positive change.
My name is Constance Brand and welcome to our show. We are starting our series with special episodes from our Europe's Environment 2025 report. Today's special episode focuses on transformative change and sustainability, key issues that are at the heart of our report. The report is the largest and most comprehensive study done on Europe's environment, climate, and sustainability, and it was released on the 29th of September. Joining me today to dissect the key elements of the report and to talk about what it means for Europe are Riyong Kim and Catherine Ganzleben. Welcome, Riyong, Catherine, to our show today. Just before we start, please explain your role that you have here at the EEA.
Well, my name is Riyong Kim. I am leading the Department on Sustainability at the European Environment Agency.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Catherine Ganzleben, and I lead the unit on sustainable and fair transitions.
Okay, great. So perhaps it's helpful to start with some basic concepts before we deep dive into all these issues. It's quite a lot of issues to cover, which we talk a lot about in our Europe's Environment report. What do we mean by transition, transformative change, changing our systems of production and consumption, and by sustainability? Riyong, you want to give that one a stab?
Absolutely. Maybe we start with sustainability because I
Yeah.
think that's the overarching topic that we are here. And of course, with the Department on Sustainability, we work a lot of these issues. Essentially, how I like to define it, it's the kind of meeting of the environment, the social and the economic. It's basically all those, if you imagine a Venn diagram, it's the meeting of the middle. So what our department and a lot of the work that we do on sustainability focuses on is the kind of interface with society and with economy. So we have a lot of issues that looking at, for example, just transitions or social issues, as well as the economics and finance issues. And so this is what makes our work at the Environment Agency really interesting, because we're trying to actually put the environment and climate into kind of, the lives of daily people. When we talk about transitions and transformative change, these are terms which have been kind of floating around quite a while and often get used interchangeably, but they're very, very different. Transition, you would imagine, is basically taking something from one state to another. How do you make it so that we can take our society and economy from the state that it is in, where it's using a lot of resources, to one that is a lot greener and sustainable? And what that would entail is like small tweaks here and there, maybe going from diesel cars or petrol cars to electric cars, those types of things. So optimizing our current systems to make it greener. Transformative change, however, is really like more of fundamental holistic change. This is really asking us to rethink, do we need to move in the same way that we have before? Do we need to use as much energy that we did before? Do we have to consume as much food? So this transformation have got really, really different meanings. And depending on who you're speaking to, you'll probably get some sense of where they're leaning to, what needs to happen next. Last thing I wanted to say is about the systems. We talk a lot about that in our upcoming report, but these are essentially, the major systems that produce and consume for our society and economy. So we talk about food systems. This is a system that has different actors, different, links in the value chain that produce different outputs. That's one system. We have a mobility system, energy system, built environment system. And these are what we call our systems of production and consumption.
Okay, great. And what do we say about these concepts in the report?
Well, we talk using these concepts as our backdrop.
Yeah.
We talk about the environment, as I mentioned before, and climate, and how that actually affects society and economy. We talk about the efforts that are made towards transition. So, for example, some of the technological innovations that have come to actually help us move to the green transition. But we also fundamentally cover what needs to happen to change the way that we are consuming and producing there. So what are some of the kind of more inherent cultural and mental shifts that we need to make. And one of our, I'm not sure if I can release the ending, but it's really about how do we look at nature?
Yeah.
Do we realize it's fundamental to us? So this is how we kind of talk about these concepts.
Yeah, great. Catherine, for you, in theory, all of these different EU activities around things like improving air quality, cutting air pollution, for instance, emissions from transport, promoting greener farming practices, or creating greener urban spaces, they're all supposed to be part of one big strategy, right? I mean, but it can be hard to see that when you're examining them individually. Can you talk more about what this is all for? How do these things come together? How are they linked?
Certainly. So I would identify a few different levels where they really combine to impact on human society. The first would be health. So when we look at environmental risk to health, things like air pollution, things like noise, but also the risks of climate change that we've seen playing out this summer with wildfires, with air pollution, and with extreme heat, those issues really come together to impact on people's quality of life. And we see that 10% of death and disease in Europe is driven by exposure to environmental risks. That's really important, and we can prevent those deaths by addressing issues like pollution and climate change. Another level is the basic needs that we depend upon in society. So, for example, the capacity for us to provide drinking water, stable, clean, high-quality drinking water. Our ability to provide clean, healthy food to people, but also things like energy, things like transport and mobility, our ability to transport goods, and all the raw materials we use to support our housing. A third level is really our economy. We know that 75% of businesses in the euro area are dependent upon what we call ecosystem services. This is things like using fresh water or using raw materials or using land to produce food. So our economy is fundamentally embedded in nature and dependent upon nature. So I would say those are three levels where we have a really tight dependency between our environment and our human quality of life, and indeed our prosperity. And so those are the things that we're looking to support by taking action on environment and climate.
Mm-hmm. And in what sense, how has Europe already connected the dots here between these areas as far as policy is concerned?
So within the EU, we have policies at very different levels. So we have policies, for example, on air quality that set limit values for pollution in air to protect human health. That's a very targeted policy looking at exposure to air pollution. We'll then have, for example, the Zero Pollution Action Plan, which looks across different types of pollution and looks to tackle them in a more comprehensive way, and also looks upstream. So not just looking at pollution in air, but where's that pollution coming from? In industry, out of the exhausts of cars driven by combustion engines, from agriculture, from our energy system. So then we have policies that really look at those systems. We have most recently, for example, the Vision for Agriculture, which looks at the agricultural system and says, how do we need to change this to ensure that we have both a sustainable supply of food, but that we also tackle the impacts that our food system has on things like water stress or biodiversity or land use.
Mm-hmm. So the report really stresses that nature can play a key role here. But a lot of people might think, well, this is all very abstract, nature, biodiversity, nature-based solutions, all these terminologies and things, but it can seem abstract. And how does this work in practice? I mean, what's being done on the ground? And what should be done on the ground? And what possibly are we working on here?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we get this question all the time. What does it mean in terms of real action? How can we translate this? These are good concepts. These are all good things we can do. So there are solutions out there. We see them all the time. And I think a large part of this upcoming report will actually be showcasing some country examples of things that we have been doing, some solutions that are actually causes for hope. And I think it's a matter of just bringing some of those stories out there, the fact that the real action can happen towards this transition or even a transformation of the way that we produce and we consume our goods and services, essentially. I think there's a real role there for not only celebrating those solutions, but also encouraging more innovation at the societal level of different ways of actually going about our lives, our daily lives that are not so carbon intensive, not so energy intensive. And I think that's where the key of innovation is. And one example I really wanted to give, and I've used it several times, is really in terms of us in how we move, the mobility system. A key transitional solution would be take your car, petrol, fossil fuels. We know that it causes emissions, but then we buy an electric one instead. Yeah, that's great. That's a transitional move that will help us go greener. A transformational move, in essence, is really saying, do you need to move that much? Do you have to? We saw from COVID, most people were working from home. Now we're only coming into work 3 or 4 days a week, 2 to 3 days a week. Do we need a second car? Maybe we don't. Maybe we can carpool. We're seeing sharing economies started to emerge where one car is shared by different audiences on an app or whatever, different clients. So there's different ways that we can look at using these resources, and we can really challenge what we thought we needed back then, maybe in our childhoods or our young adulthoods. Maybe they're not the same things as what new generations actually need.
Yeah. I mean, we have the technology in place, and I think the last report, SOER 2020, talked about leveraging up, but now we need to leverage out. Can you explain a little bit?
Leveraging out, I think it's probably along the lines of, can we then now talk about changing the way that we consume, essentially. So I think that this is really at the heart of this transformation idea. Like, we know that fundamentally, if we keep, assuming that we need the same type of energy demand, because our energy demand has basically increased so much as a population, as individuals, but we just made this basic blanket assumption that this is going to be our energy demand from now into the future. And this is why we're desperately searching for new energy sources. But maybe we haven't even stopped to actually question, is that really our demand in the future? Maybe it isn't. It's kind of, these political choices are being made with a real kind of impetus or a drive that's saying, well, we need to provide energy in the same way and at the same quantities as we have in the past. And that trajectory is acceleration. It is just increased need for energy. But we've never asked ourselves the question, what about getting out of that system of energy intensiveness?
Yeah. A lot of big questions. And I think another question that we hear a lot is, the urgency for change. And again, we're stressing that in this report. We need to act faster, especially on climate change. There's a lot of climate fatigue out there. There's fatigue about the environment. Attention spans are shorter than ever with the 24-hour news cycle that we live in. We've seen quite a bit of progress already in Europe, and some people might argue on certain political levels that, we've done enough in Europe. Maybe it's time for other regions, other countries in the world to step up. We see progress in emissions reductions here in Europe, air pollution improvements, quality of water. What does the report say to that? Why is action still urgent? So what?
Yeah, so I can take that and perhaps unpack it a bit. Certainly, I think we see evidence of the need for urgent action around climate change adaptation in Europe in response to the climate impacts that are playing out on a daily basis. You see them in the news these days, particularly most recently wildfires in Europe and extreme heat this summer. But if I unpack it and take it first at the level of citizens, individuals, and then at the level of politics, I would say. So at a citizen level, I think we see a large number of people shifting their behaviors and their consumption patterns, choosing to bike rather than take the car or use public transport, making efforts to cut their energy consumption, investing in heat pumps, shifting their diets. All of that makes a difference. It makes a difference, and it's to be celebrated. It also, in terms of choices people make about the kinds of products they buy, sends signals to the upstream producers that people are building sustainability as a criterion in their choices about what they buy. That is important, it's valuable, it's to be celebrated. At the same time, in Europe, we are continuing to consume more and more. And much of the impact of our consumption is actually felt outside Europe, because most of the goods we consume, many of them, are actually produced in third countries. And that means that the climate footprint, but also the resource footprint, the material footprint, is outside of Europe. And there, I think we have to acknowledge that not everyone across the world could have the lifestyle that we enjoy in Europe because we do not have enough resources at global scale. So there's an inequity issue there. And I think we need to look at our consumption patterns in Europe and, as you say, rethink about how we live, how we consume, how we move. If I then look at the political level, there's a lot of focus now on issues around competitiveness and indeed, of course, security. In terms of competitiveness, I would argue that sustainability is a dimension of competitiveness and will continue to be into the future. In particular, decarbonization is a must. We know that we have to decarbonize our production and our economy. But I think competitiveness also brings in dimensions of well-being for citizens, that we ultimately have an economy that serves people rather than people serving the economy. So we've got to get that right.
Just interlude. I mean, people could argue that, this is putting us at an economic disadvantage compared to other global economies around the world. Is that something we need to take account of?
We do need to take account of that. But I think the two dimensions of competitiveness there are, one, energy cost, where we are looking to address that. And in fact, the use of renewables has cut our energy costs because renewables are now cheaper than fossil fuels. And it also means we can reduce our dependency on imports from abroad. So in my view, the shift towards a more sustainable energy system is a competitive advantage. Mm-hmm. The other dimension is labor costs. And I don't think anyone would argue that we should reduce our labor costs to the levels that they are, particularly in the Asian countries or South Americans, because that would undercut the well-being of our society, which is exactly what our economy is supposed to support.
Yeah.
That's a broader argument. If we look at security, then I think we need to move beyond the vision of security being around defense and indeed weapons, and move towards a vision that includes adaptation to climate change, which is really going to threaten our security in the long term. Water security, having access to sufficient water for sanitation and drinking, and indeed for industrial production. Food security. And all of those depend on getting right our relationship with nature.
Mm-hmm. But also working with other partners on the world. Clearly, these environmental, like climate change, has no borders.
Certainly. I mean, it's an issue that plays out at global scale. Yeah. And we've seen in Europe that we have been effective in making a transition in our energy systems. We now have 25% of our energy through renewables. We have been starting to address energy demand and seen some fall over the past decades. So there has been a positive shift there. And that has cut our greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah.
But of course, EU greenhouse gas emissions are a fraction of global emissions, which continue to rise. So we need then to not just look at cutting greenhouse gas emissions, but really look at how we adapt to climate change, because it's coming, it's here today, and we need to change in order to make sure that we are ready.
That's crystal clear. Yeah. Another question. What about the costs involved? I mean, for instance, renovating homes or buildings, many homeowners are quite concerned about the costs of, replacing gas boilers with heat pumps and so forth. I mean, this can be costly.
Absolutely.
This transformative change is going to cost.
It's going to cost. The transition is also going to cost. So what is the choice that we're making here? I think, just to give the mobility or the COVID example, we've seen like large, lots of buildings basically be deserted in Brussels, in some of these big cities that aren't actually at full capacity anymore, and people are letting go of these buildings and not being used anymore. So, that's a point beside, but it comes back to this question of like, is it everything that we need to kind of retrofit with energy efficient solutions, or maybe there's only a certain number because we're occupying less space? So these are some of the questions that building owners or even governments need to start asking themselves. Do we keep trying to do these incremental fixes on the things that we already have, the stock that we already have, because maybe we don't need to fix all that stock. Maybe we don't have to kind of green all that stock. Maybe we need to start asking questions on and looking at, well, what are the needs of the future? Maybe they don't need, all the buildings to be retrofitted and they won't occupy all that space. Maybe we do need more green space and get rid of some of those buildings, or less roads, or whatever it might be. But there will be costs involved. Well, you can argue in the Industrial Revolution, we made our wealth for free. We relied on the resources, we got them for free, and now we need to actually pay a bit to kind of remedy all the impacts that we're having on the environment. So yes, it's going to be costly. And in the past several years and even decades, it's always been the bill that's been footed by the public. This is where we start talking about, well, how do we start getting that cost into the balance sheets of the corporations, of the companies, of the private sector? Because now they might have been getting the resources for free to kind of produce whatever goods they might have, but they need to start also realizing that there's a bill attached.
No, we're talking about green investments, really, which is a positive, no?
Exactly.
It's not creating jobs.
Yeah, and mainstreaming the kind of climate environmental cost into general production and consumption. So it doesn't always end up on the consumer. So I really, really accept that point that people are afraid that this will become a massive bill, but there's a huge, role that the private sector as well as the public sector that they need to play to subsidize that economic shock that could potentially be coming, essentially.
And there's also other many changes we mentioned in the report about how we produce and consume food, energy, and other goods. Also, people are concerned about more expensive food, for instance, if we start, putting carbon tax on meat, for instance.
Absolutely. But again, there I think is a key role for some of those middle players within that value chain that need to start incorporating the costs of these impacts that they're having. This is in economics, we call them externalities. They've been external to our financial and economic system. These are the things that now need to be internalized into the cost of their business. So it doesn't end up on the consumer bill, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Okay. When we talk about the key takeaways of the report, we need to keep in mind, what do we need to keep in mind going forward about the report?
I would say our key takeaways are, first of all, that our health and well-being, but also our economy is underpinned by nature, by natural resources. And what we see, the evidence that we present in the report, which is based on robust data that we receive from our 38 member countries and cooperating countries, what that data and evidence shows is that we continue to degrade our environment. Particularly, we see biodiversity loss, largely linked to agriculture, but also other pressures like climate change. We continue to see pollution, chemical pollution of air, water, and soil. And we see, of course, large-scale risks and indeed impacts today from climate change. At the same time, there are seeds of hope. We really do see seeds of hope, and we really talk about those in the report. We mentioned already the change in the energy system, which has delivered significant cuts in greenhouse gas emissions over the past few decades. The penetration of renewables into the energy system, that's a really positive change. We also see improvements, for example, in air quality across Europe. And those translate into saved lives because air pollution drives death and disease. Yeah. So when we cut air pollution, we are saving lives. People are living longer, healthier lives. And I think what we need to do next is really find ways to translate the success that we've seen in the energy system, which has been driven by ambitious European policies. We need to translate that success across our agricultural system, our industrial systems, and our transport systems. And really, what we try to do in the report is present a range of different levers that we can use to do that, looking, for example, at technological innovation, but also looking at social innovation, where communities together make choices to do things differently. And we have wonderful examples from across Europe. There's also opportunities within the financial system to really make changes in terms of incentivizing investments in sustainability. So there's a range of levers out there, not least the implementation of European policy by the member states in a rigorous and robust way that will drive the kinds of change that we need to see.
Mm-hmm. And what does the report say? The pathway, is it realistic? Can we get there?
I hope we can get there. I believe we can get there. It's not straightforward. There is a redistribution issue. There are vested interests that are working against us. But I certainly believe we can get there. Otherwise, I wouldn't do this job.
Yeah. And maybe just to add to that, I mean, it's not going to be easy. It is a complex task, but we got ourselves into this very complex situation of these interrelated systems of how we produce and consume our goods and services. And that needs untangling. All of that needs to kind of be looked at in its entirety. And we need to really ask ourselves, how do we, produce something different that is sustainable, that can balance all three pillars: society, economy, and environment. So it's complex, but it's doable because we've got the solutions out there, and at least we're hopeful. Yes.
So this is part of the show where we ask our guests a bit more personal question: what drives them? What makes them passionate about the work they do here at the EEA? So Catherine, I'll start with you. What drives you to work in environment and climate issues?
So thanks, Godston. I think two things. Firstly, as an individual, I really have a passion for nature. I really enjoy spending time in natural environments, lakes, mountains, forests, beaches. And so beyond all the ways in which we humans use and depend on nature, I think there's an intrinsic value there that we should preserve and conserve and take care of and have responsible stewardship of. And also a bit of humility about our place as a living organism within nature. So I see myself as part of nature. And then secondly, very simply, I have 3 children, and we're looking at sustainability, which is about long-term stewardship of the environment and climate. I want them to have a healthy, secure future.
Okay, and Riyong, what about you?
Yeah, so what drives me about this? I think essentially it's a topic that, I've been working pretty much all of my career on environmental issues. As you can hear, I'm from Australia, and looking to Europe, I see that, Europe is a leader in this particular space. And with this particular report, I think there was such a huge opportunity together with Catherine and the team to actually put out a message on how fundamental nature is to our quality of life, our well-being, future prosperity, which I think people really take for granted. I often give an example of my aunt who lives in rural Jutland in Denmark, and trying to explain the work that I do. And I struggle every time to kind of really embody the importance of why I do this to the normal citizen. And I think this is what hopefully we do with this report, to kind of really just emphasize this is why it's important, because we are jeopardizing the future richness and resources of our planet. And we're really basically cutting the legs that we're standing on if we don't do this. And finally, we get a chance to say it, which is really great. So I'm really excited. It drives me. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Riyong. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Constant.
Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to our guests for their insights. If you want more information on Europe's Environment 2025 report, please visit our website at eea.europa.eu, where there's also more information on climate, environment, and sustainability issues. On our next episode, we're going to delve into water and biodiversity. How do we preserve our clean waters and preserve and protect our nature? Join us next time.